time now to turn our attention to news from South Asia with our reporter Rani Singh. She started off by telling me about the COVID-19 situation in Pakistan, and it's not quite what you might think.
As you've been reporting over here on the show, in the US, cases are rising, and in the UK, for you, cases are getting to a worrying level. And you'd think, with what's going on over in South Asia with Indian cases rising, you'd think that Pakistan would be following the same trend. But they're not. They're confounding the experts, and the COVID case rate there is flattening off. That's despite the fact that the rate of testing is really, really low, probably about 1% of the population. But what the experts are finding is that out of the tests that have been done, the positivity for COVID-19 is still low. So there's something else going on. And it could link back, Suzanne, to the fact that Pakistan experienced, sadly, a polio pandemic several years ago, which was really bad. And it seems that Pakistan, after setting up an infrastructure in the wake of that polio outbreak to deal with it, a polio support network, if you will, they've been able to use that. So polio has informed COVID. And I found this out by talking to Dr. Salman Ahmed, who I've had onto this show before. He's an American Pakistani, and he's the COVID-19 Goodwill Ambassador for South Asia with the Skoll Foundation. Now, interestingly, he's also a rock star and the founder and lead guitar and the songwriter for Asia's biggest band, Junoon. And he's the kind of Asian equivalent, if you will, of a genius like Bono, or if you consider Bono to be a genius. So this gentleman has got a lot of hitting power because he's a doctor, he keeps his qualifications up, and he's married to a doctor. Now, he's just spent, in fact, he's in Lahore in Pakistan right now, and he's just spent 3 months on the road, not doing music, but investigating out into slums, rural areas where 63% of the Pakistani population lives, and in the towns and cities as well. And he's been talking to health officials, both private and public. And before this, he was a Goodwill Ambassador for polio, so he's well informed. And he says that they managed to get polio down to a really, really low level until a few years ago using a polio surveillance network, as I said. And this consists of about 1 million Pakistanis all spread out across Pakistan. So they're the ones who now, when COVID hit really badly over there in June, when there was a real spike, they were able to inform authorities. And that's when the government really started activating these local lockdowns, not a national one, local lockdowns that are now being adopted, I believe, in the UK and other countries. And Salman, going out to the rural areas, found that the virus hadn't been able to penetrate into these uncongested areas. And this is absolutely mystifying the experts over there and Salman. They say, is it down to the local diet? Is it down to the heat and humidity? Or is it down to a particular strain of the coronavirus that's hit Pakistan that's less virulent than other strains? And then another funny thing happened, or strange thing, and that is that when the virus was at its worst in June, 11% of the population that did test positive, they were asymptomatic. And the experts are mulling over the idea that perhaps this 11% created a firewall of immunity for the whole community. But whatever has happened, the curve has been flattening. However, Pakistan is not out of danger yet, because in a couple of weeks, 50 million Pakistani students, Suzanne, are going to be heading back to very congested urban areas, to the universities and to the colleges. And there's already been a little bit of a spike, and 22 of those universities have closed. So the real test is going to come in a couple of weeks.
So that covers some of the situation in Pakistan, but it's very different hugely different in India. What's going on there, Rani?
Well, in India, Suzanne, sadly, the number of cases is rising to make it the second highest number of cases in the world now. In India, the Prime Minister Modi, he instituted a different strategy and he imposed a national lockdown very, very quickly, with about 4 hours' notice to the entire Indian population. Now, I don't know if you're aware, but the bulk of the workers in India are daily wage earners. If they don't work for a day, they don't get paid. They're sort of rickshaw people, laborers, manual workers. They're without salaries and without any security. So with this unannounced lockdown, they were suddenly bereft of not only their work, but most of them of homes and any means of support whatsoever. And they're mainly migrants, and they had no choice but to leave the cities and towns, which is where they were working mainly, and go back to their rural places, their villages. And the only way they could go was to walk because the transportation had been shut down too. Now, it's thought that because they'd been in the towns, they took the virus bug with them. And that's why the coronavirus is hitting all over India, even in rural areas. And experts are also saying, I mean, we've reported it with the BBC, that though the cases are so high, the deaths seem to be low. And why is this? You know, people are asking. Now, comparatively low per head of population. But there are two reasons possible for this. One is that there's an extraordinary amount of miscounting that goes on, or undercounting. Secondly, many of the Indians who have died, as with elsewhere, have underlying disease. There's a lot of heart problems, there's diabetes, all sorts in India. And when these patients die, if their deaths are recorded, what's put is two causes of death. And mostly they'll leave out the COVID-19 and they'll put cardiac arrest or diabetes or something like that. So COVID isn't even appearing. And that could be another reason why deaths per head of population appear to be low.
Now, they're trying out a new COVID ventilator in Bangladesh, but what's unusual about this is it was actually made in Wales back in April, but by that point our cases were beginning to tail off and they didn't have enough patients, so they're now trying it out in Bangladesh. What more do you know about this, Rani?
Yes, that's right. Have you got some Welsh blood, Suzanne? I can't remember.
I've got a Welsh husband, so I suppose I've got Welsh children.
Okay,
yeah.
Yes. Well, this is a story after your own heart then. Carmarthenshire in Wales is where an engineer and a doctor managed to construct this ventilator. It's called a CPAP, and it's a prototype. It was created there, very easy to make in a way. It's designed that way, and they built it in less than a week. Now, as you say, the cases were not very high at that time in Wales, so they needed a place to trial. So they linked up with Pakistan's top university. It's a hospital and university in the capital, Dhaka. It's the Bangal Bandhu Sheikh Mujib Medical University Hospital. And they shipped out their 35 machines, and they were quickly assembled, and the devices seem to be working very successfully. Now, why are ventilators so important in the treatment of COVID? Well, I don't know if you know, but when patients get very seriously ill with COVID-19, they're suffering from a lack of oxygen in the blood, but this is a silent event, and they won't know until they really get to a place where they can be checked, and then they need to be put onto a ventilator immediately. And the sooner they're put on, the more likely that they'll be able to be saved. So these ventilators are really, really crucial in the care of COVID. In Dhaka, they're reporting, the professor there in the hospital is saying that the results look very promising for this landmark trial. And it could be that if the Welsh team progress from trialing to manufacture after they get funding, they're hoping for money from America, that it could be a ray of hope to do with this virus.
It's just lovely when there's a tiny hint of some good news, isn't there? Of some sort of global cooperation from Wales to Bangladesh. So fingers crossed that this gives the results that everyone's hoping for.
Yes.
Now, I hate to bring up this next case, but it's a problem that Pakistan and, to a certain extent, India seem to deal with often. Another, Rani, horrendous rape case making the news.
I'm sorry to have to report this, Suzanne, but it is another watershed moment for Pakistan with a slightly different outcome recently. So that's particularly why I want to flag it up, although sadly on this very show, I've needed to report this kind of event repeatedly across South Asia over the last year at least. I should preface this by saying, Suzanne, that in 2011, the Thomson Reuters Foundation rated Pakistan the most dangerous country in the world for women. Now that it's fortunately lost that ranking, but it's still pretty high up there. And I would say that in Pakistan and in India, a woman of any age cannot feel totally safe. This latest incident involved a French national on the 11th of September. She was driving along one of the motorways with her two children in the car, and she ran out of petrol. It was about 1:30 in the morning, and she phoned the police for help. But before they could get to her car, two men took her and her children out of the car at gunpoint, took them to a field where they raped the women in front of her children, stole cash and jewelry and bank cards, and then fled the scene. Now, somehow she managed to get herself back into a town and go to report it to the police. Now, there was a huge outcry, and it's not unusual in a patriarchal society like Pakistan for authorities and figures to be able to come out and make questionable judgments. And the lead police investigator, Omar Sheikh, reportedly said the woman should have taken a busier road, she shouldn't have travelled at night, and she should have made sure her car had enough petrol in it. She should also have known that Pakistan is not as safe a country as France, which is her country of residence. Now, this has caused a huge outcry, and you can see footage on television of masked, mainly female protectors, masked for safety at the moment, coming out onto the streets saying, hang the rapists, displaying flags, French flags of solidarity, and seeking justice, because at the moment there is actually no law protecting victims of either sex in Pakistan from this kind of attack. Now, I have noticed over the last months and couple of years that women have become more vocal. Most of the protests that happen on the streets are led by women, and they're quite fearless. And sometimes the authorities, very often now, the authorities are forced to take notice. The Prime Minister has called for rapists and paedophiles to be publicly hanged or chemically or physically castrated for their crimes. And he might find it difficult to get the first suggestion through. But it has raised a debate, and he's now discussing these punishments with his cabinet. It's been a very long time coming, all of this, Suzanne. And at the end of the day, there is hardly any accountability by the police authorities and other authorities in Pakistan and even in India very often. So the pronouncements are very, very interesting to hear from the authorities, but I don't really know what good it'll do and if there is going to be change, when it'll come.
Surely in this case, though, it may well have been helpful that she was a French national, because it then becomes a matter of national pride, because no one wants to think of their country as being a place where other people can come and not be safe. And it sounds like a terrible thing to say, but maybe the government is taking more notice because the woman is not from Pakistan.
I think that's a sad truth, Suzanne. And of course, it's early days yet, and we have to see official statements and things yet from the French side in more detail. So it could be that this is a turning point. But definitely when coronavirus is around and everything, to see these women out on the streets, young and old, protesting fearlessly, I think that's also going to make a difference. But the fact that the lady, the unfortunate lady, is a foreign national may make the authorities feel more accountable, at least on the surface.
Another piece of good news, thankfully, a Bangladeshi American has been nominated for a Nobel Prize this year, along with, of course, President Trump. This is the Peace Prize that we are talking about. So who's been nominated and what have they been nominated for?
That's right. The Peace Prize I'm referring to from Bangladesh might be their third one. Mostly the prize is won by either America or the UK or France, Germany, Western nations. This is Bangladeshi American Dr. Ruhul Abid, who's at Brown University. And he's started a non-profit called Health and Education for All, and it distributes free healthcare to the underprivileged. I've been into big deprived areas in Bangladesh, and I've seen prototypes like this where there are care rooms with health facilities, and the ladies of the local area are invited to come and learn and receive free items as well. And I found that they're very effective with these facilities available. So this gentleman, Professor Abed, has been helping garment factory workers in Bangladesh who all tend to be very, very poor, Rohingya refugees. And he's also created electronic medical record system, which is portable. And with most of the Bangladeshis being illiterate, there's an individualized ID system using your fingerprints. So that's a very useful thing that's been going into camps. And he's also been responsible for a cancer screening program. So these are his reasons for being nominated, and we'll see in a few months who wins.
Now, what's happening with the friction between China and India over their border? This is something you've been looking at for quite a long time, Rani.
It is ramping up. I mean, we should say when we talk about China and India, we talk about the mighty dragon and the elephant. But in terms of military might, it's really a mighty dragon and a very, very small elephant indeed, in terms of defense budgets and things like that. But what's happened is that India's been building tunnels and a whole series of roads and bridges right up to the Chinese border that could perhaps support the launch of surface-to-air missiles at the Chinese border. And we know, of course, that both countries are nuclear armed. Now, why are we talking about the border? Because it's a really odd border. It goes through mountains and through rivers and in ravines. And, you know, in the eastern Himalayas there, the tectonic plates are shifting, you know, and they're the youngest range of the Himalayas. So the mountains are still moving. So that border, not only can it move, it's also really badly drawn and ill-defined. And both China and India have got their own version of it, and neither of them agree as to the actual border. And it's called the line of actual control, by the way. So this causes both countries to get cross and angry with each other. So angry that in 1962 they had a war, and there are certain rules up at the border area, like neither side is supposed to have big artillery or guns up there. So what happened is that recently from May, there's been a real escalation in tension with one side or the other crossing the border, resulting in clashes. And in June, as India was building these roads up to the high altitude airbase, the Chinese then got quite angry. There were clashes at the border and 20 Indian soldiers were killed. And this was the first fatal clash since 1975. The Chinese didn't say how many of their soldiers were killed. And they were fighting up at the border with sticks and clubs on these narrow ledges at the side of the mountain, so that they only had to lose their footing, the soldiers, and their fate would be determined. It is very, very tense up there, with both sides building up their military presences. So the world is watching quite carefully. And although the foreign ministers have met and glad-handed and said there should be peace, other things are going on up at the border. It's actually an area of South Asia that I really am fascinated by. And whenever I'm investigating or researching, I'm usually up in this Himalayan region. And I've got to know the Tibetan tribes up there very well. They're Tibetan Buddhists, and of course the most famous of the Tibetan Buddhists is the Dalai Lama and his family, and many of them revere him. The tribes people are called Mompas, and they're ethnic Tibetans. And with this sort of border that has been created between them, some of them sit on the Chinese side and some of them live on the Indian side, but they're all Mompas, simple, God-fearing people. And both countries sort of utilize them for their own purposes. President Xi said to the Chinese Mompas, "You are ours and you should stay here and be proud of being Chinese." And the Indian Mompas often look wistfully along the border. When I've been up there, I've got quite friendly with a few of them. And they say, "We'd love to go to our original homeland, Tibet, across the border. But we fear that if we go across, we don't know if we'd be allowed back and if we'd be harassed by soldiers from both sides." And of course, they all are mainly peace-loving people, very simple. And it's very basic up there, but it's a fascinating area to visit.
That's our reporter Rani Singh bringing us the news from South Asia.